I hope everybody is having a wonderful morning so far. Thank you very much to the previous chair and the previous panelists. Today's discussion, or at least the discussion we're going to be leading right now, is focused on the Regulatory Cooperation Council. Now, before we get into that, I have a very important announcement to make. This evening after the conference, the Detroit Consulate has been very generous and is sponsoring a filming in sponsorship with the Cleveland International Film Festival. Now, the film is a French-Canadian film, a comedy called The Sense of Humor. In French, it's The Sense of Humor in French. Thank you. Merci. The consulate has been very, very generous and has arranged for a bus transportation. It will be picking people up at the Glidden House at 6:30. There will be a limited number of boxed dinners. So if you are interested, I urge you to please come. There will be a lot of fun, and there will be a reception afterward in the Oak Room with, I believe, the Consul General will be joining us. And there will be refreshments and meat. We cannot turn that down, as well as bus transportation back at 11 p.m. If you're interested, contact Mary Lynn. Could you raise your hand, please? And I'll be making periodic announcements throughout the day as well. So you're probably wondering, who is this guy? Unfortunately, Peter Gerhardt was unable to chair the panel. I have a deep amount of respect and admiration for him. He's a genius, so I have enormously big shoes to fill. But I will ask a lot of dumb questions in the hope that you all will not feel embarrassed to ask questions as well. It should be no problem. The Regulatory Cooperation Council, as was brought up by the ambassador earlier this morning, is a very important and parallel agreement that is running with the Beyond the Border Working Group. Now, there's a lot of questions on why that's parallel, and our panelists will get in that today. It is so important that we've actually put the entire action plan for the RCC in the CLE materials. So I urge everybody to look into it more deeply, but we will get into more of the details on behalf of the panelists. At this point, I would like to introduce briefly those who will be helping us guide ourselves through this discussion. To my right, starting on my left, is Ms. Laura Dawson. Laura is a former fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. She owns a think tank, a consulting firm called Dawson Strategic. She's also a very active blogger on many topics, including regulatory harmonization and other matters related to Canada-U.S. relations. She's also a very active, engaged individual in the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. To her right is Kelly Johnston. Kelly is an in-house counsel for Campbell Soup. He's been very gracious to spend a time talking about his experiences working with regulatory harmonization. He has been a very strong, vocal dialogue in the discussion, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to say today. And last but certainly not least is Mr. Christopher Sands. Chris is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Chris is also another very active member of the advisory board, as well as co-chair of our experts meeting with Laura that we had last month in February in Washington, D.C. And Chris's focuses are on Canada-U.S. relations. So I'd like to get the conversation started by exploring 5 topics today. First, we'd like to set the preliminary groundwork, sort of introduce those who aren't familiar with regulatory harmonization about what it is, why it matters, and why we're talking about it today. We'd like to talk about the nature of the goals of harmonizing our country's regulatory structures, outline the barriers and obstacles that the countries will face, how we can overcome these barriers, and then looking towards the future, what does success look like, and what can we expect down the road? And then we'll have some closing takeaways. Now, throughout this process, we'd like to engage this panel as more of a roundtable discussion. We want this to be an engaged, active discussion between our panelists, and so I'll be peppering them with questions, shooting questions at them throughout, and they'll be questioning one another throughout to really try to get the discussion flowing. Now, if you as audience members have questions along the way, I highly encourage you to participate in this Q&A throughout the process. And what that means is I would like, if you would, please simply stand up and come down, and I will be visually keeping note of that and try to divert the question to you so they can respond in line as it's being discussed. Now, if we have time, and hopefully we don't because you'll be peppering questions along the way too. But if we do, we'll also open up to a general Q&A. So that is the format, and we hope that, that you have fun with us. I know that we're looking forward to it. So starting off, I'd like to ask a question. Chris, why don't you go into what we're talking about when we mean regulatory harmonization?
Sure. Well, I'm talking to a group of very smart lawyers, so you know the way that regulation works, and I won't talk too much about that, but what I think is interesting here and worthy of note is that regulation, obviously you need regulation so the economy can function, has been based on national economies. Governments regulate things within their jurisdiction. What we've found increasingly since Canada's free trade and even before that is that the economy survives on cross-border flows of things, people, goods, etc. More and more of the things we produce, build, more and more of our livelihood crosses borders. And when you cross borders, you introduce two regulatory frameworks at least on either side of the border. That adds to the compliance cost, it adds to the cost of doing business, even when those regulations may not be very different. And I think the challenge as we try to eliminate borders to international commerce and barriers to international commerce is to make sure that those kinds of differences are minimized so that we don't create a drag. Now, if you look around the world of globalization, I know I'm not going to give a long speech, but just I love the big picture. I think a lot of us, when globalization started to be bandied about, we thought globalization has changed the world in which we live so that the minimum efficient scale of production for everything is the whole world. So you have to get with the program. That's true for some internet things and maybe some chips and this and that. But for most things, it's actually much smaller than that. It's regional. You look at the big economies around the world, Europe, China, Brazil within Mercosur, India, they all manage a regulatory environment that has worked to try to streamline the regulatory process. Now, Europe does it through negotiation. China does it because it's one country, and if you screw up, they shoot you. So we have these systems. North America competes with that, not just with 3 different country regulation systems, but also with all the states, the provinces, municipalities. Everybody has a way in, as we saw with Keystone Pipeline and we see with other things. There are lots of jurisdictions here. So the challenge for us increasingly is not tariff reduction. It's not other aspects of economic governance. It's getting some sort of governance for these cross-border flows that makes sense from a business perspective. And I think that's the ambition of RCC. It's the ambition of what we're trying to do, and it'll be with us for the next century at least.
Lori, it looks like you have something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of break it down to the boring granular level. When I was starting with this stuff while I was working for Ambassador Jacobson, we heard from many people that regulatory cooperation is where good careers go to die because, frankly, it is just so boring. But what we're talking about specifically are 3 operational areas. These are matters that take place away from the border. These are, as Chris says, in domestic regimes, and we're trying to link the 2 of them up. There's 3 areas. One of them is the standards and the regulations themselves. Are they the same or similar? And if not, why not? Then the second operational area would be testing and certification. Are we testing for particular product standards, safety standards, the same way on both sides of the border? And if we're doing that, can we have the same testing and certification labs recognize each other's results? Or do we have to have the same product tested in 2 different areas? And the third operational area is, even if we've agreed to have the same standards and the same testing and certification methods, the third operational area is in phase-in times and modalities. If we say in 2015 we're going to have the same standard on light-duty vehicle emissions, well, if you do all the hard work in your jurisdiction right away and I wait for 2 years before I implement those changes, then we've got manufacturers who are stuck in the middle saying, should I stay or should I go? Where do I do the changes to my manufacturing process to meet that standard? So what we're talking about are those 3 operational areas, and we're talking about domestic regimes that take place largely away from the border, and we're talking about ways to knit them up.
Now, Chris, you had mentioned that it's been successful with other countries, and Laura, you did a very good job at outlining very succinctly the 3 points, and it seems so straightforward. So What has been the holdup? Kelly, I know in your paper that you submitted, you talked about some of the previous attempts that the countries have made. What were the stumbling blocks that we faced that didn't get us to deal?
Well, I think that if you look at the most recent example, one I'm most familiar with and still carry the scars on my back trying to work on, was a Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America. Very well intended, great concept, excited the business community to no end. We thought, oh, finally, we have attention from the top to address what I've referred to, others refer to, and in fact, Ambassador Jacobson mentioned this morning, the tyranny of small differences that really add to the cost, complexity. But more importantly, and I think this is what the driving force was, just before I answer your question, is you look at where we're really competing. The U.S. doesn't really compete economically, believe it or not, with Canada. Yeah, there are competitors inside the region that do compete with each other. That's the free market system. But ultimately, when you look around the globe, the U.S. and Canada make things together. And then if you look at what our competition is, it's really Asia and Europe and other parts of the world. If you look at what's transpired in the European Union, they have a common market. They have an economic union where our truck from a Campbell soup plant in Belgium can drive all the way to the coast of France or Germany or Denmark without ever having to stop. We don't have that luxury right now in North America, and parts of Asia are a entirely different story. So the beauty of this was, how can we capitalize on the concept of regulatory cooperation? I want to, for some people, the word harmonization is kind of like that P word. It scares people, or as we say in Oklahoma, it gives you the heebie-jeebies. So I understand that completely. And so I prefer, and I like the word regulatory cooperation, because harmonization implies, well, gee, this is going to affect my sovereignty. What am I going to give up? I think Ambassador Jacobson gave a great definition this morning of that when he said it, to better align regulatory approaches. So I want to mention it. I think the stumbling blocks, get to your question, for us have been that when the governments have set up, as we did with the SPP, a process to try to solicit input from the private sector, those agencies became graveyards where good ideas went to die. And in fact, in the SPP, the most disappointing experience was the fact that the agencies themselves, both in Canada and the U.S., now this may be more perception than reality, were actually resisting the objectives of the SPP than we're trying to work with it. That was the impression that we got.
Now, you mentioned tyranny of small differences. Now, kind of moving into the nature of the harmonization question, is it a matter of differences in the regulations, or is there a pushback that the industry is really concerned about too much regulation?
In some cases, it is too much regulation. In fact, and one thing I've made a point on, both as part of the SPP, but also especially the Beyond the Border process, is that let's not limit ourselves here to just trying to resolve differences in regulation. In some cases, the countries both have the same very bad regulation, and are impediments to what I think the overall objective is to make our economies more competitive, lower prices for products, really serve our consumers, customers, citizens more effectively. So it's a case of really both. Yes, it is primarily differences. There are some huge differences in my world. In fact, that's why I think food and agriculture was made a prime industry. In fact, it's the first chapter of the Regulatory Cooperation Council Action Plan is addressing food and ag, because we're the second largest manufacturing industry between the two. And if you've seen what's happened to auto world, we've kind of eclipsed them once in a while to number one. So there are some massive differences. I won't go into, if I start getting into the weeds, I will see eyes glaze over. If I want to put people into a total trance, I just start mentioning some of these individual regulations in my world. As you said, Laura, can be very boring for a lot of people. But they do exist. They're very expensive. They take a lot of infrastructure. It's hard to quantify because they constantly change, and sometimes the enforcement varies. And even within our own country, I mean, the U.S., sometimes its own worst enemy. We have, unlike Canada, we happen to have two very different food safety agencies. So I'd like to see us align better our own food safety systems in the United States. So I'm hoping that one of the consequences of Beyond the Border is not just to help improve the cooperation and better align regulatory approaches and standards and systems, and really have mutual recognition. The word I use is equivalency. In fact, it's to what's been said earlier. When you hear the word, say, inspect once, clear twice, that means when a food product that I make in my plant in Toronto is inspected by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. When it comes down to the border to go to the U.S., it doesn't have to be re-inspected again or samples pulled. It can just, you're looking at okay, you're free, come on in, and you're done. That's what that really means for us.
Okay.
And let me just add on that. One of the things that can make this a confusing topic is that domestically within the United States, we have regulatory reform. Now, that's not cooperation. It's the fact that, going back to the Ford administration, the Carter administration, on a bipartisan basis, administrations have been trying to figure out how can we make regulation work fairly well, largely in the executive branch. Mm-hmm. Now, the challenge is that regulation and overlap of regulatory agencies is sometimes not something dreamt up in the White House, but it comes from statute. It comes because different congressional committees want to have jurisdiction over a business that's important in their constituency back home. And so you have legislatively mandated overlaps and inefficiencies that have not been part of the discipline. And then you have judicially mandated regulation where the courts will say, if this isn't, the EPA finding on carbon was the court saying, no, you really do need to regulate this stuff. They got a mandate that came out of the courts. So you can get regulation from all sorts of sources. We've tried regulatory reform at home in the United States. It's a big process, a long history. And international cooperation is coming in at a kind of angle of tangency with this effort. And we need both domestic regulatory reform, maybe even some deregulation in some areas, but we also need to do cooperation, and we're trying to do both at the same time, which is a big challenge.
On the inspected once, cleared twice argument, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have the same rules and standards. All it means is that, say, there is a certain percentage of sodium that is allowed in a soup in Canada and another different percentage of sodium that is allowed in a soup in the United States for very important, distinct public health reasons that I can't begin to speculate on. CFIA could inspect to see that both of those levels are met. They could tick the boxes in both areas, so it doesn't have to be re-inspected across the border. So that's sort of an enlightened approach to efficiencies where we can get them while still respecting a possibility of legitimate public policy differences.
And those of you guys who are familiar with maybe manufacturing know that one of the things that we've seen internationally is an attempt to create sort of private sector standards that beat the government standards. So whether it's United Laboratories, the Canadian Standards Association, or maybe it's the ISO process, what can we do that would beat or surpass everything everybody's asking so I can create a product that meets that standard that can move everywhere? So that's where the inspection comes in. Can we verify that it meets the standard? But I think the private sector will determine whether to produce a sodium level for Canada, Cheerios for Canada, Cheerios for the US, if it's cost effective and if it makes sense. But the key is, can we agree on these inspection differences so that if we've crash tested cars, for example, and we can publish the regulations in the three countries, crash one set of cars and say, well, we look at the data says meets all three standards or four standards or a dozen standards, and just accept that rather than having to crash it in three labs in three countries or more.
Now, is there any risk that the government regulatory agencies are going to say, well, we can harmonize, but we need to increase the regulations to harmonize, simply to protect whatever interest?
I think I'll give you an example where I think that even the industry has said that some increased regulation or at least some intense focus may be required, and that's when the U.S., when President Obama last year signed into law the new Food Safety Modernization Act, which has enormous implications for beyond the border regulatory cooperation, food safety in the perimeter, when we realized there were some mostly imported ingredients, frankly coming from China, and not exclusively, that were tainted. Were falsely identified and were poisoning, killing mostly pets, but also people. And so it realized, oh, you know what, we have to invest more resources, change some focuses here, change some regulatory approaches. So yes, and in the industry, my company in particular, strongly supported that new law. And now it's going through the process of an implementation process. And the neat thing is, but because we have the Regulatory Cooperation Council in place, there's actually a very strong amount of collaboration going on between Canada and the U.S. on helping to influence what the FDA's regulations are, because those regulations that the U.S. adopts may also inform what Canada does. So an example where having the Regulatory Cooperation Council with this new U.S. law is a terrific thing.
And I'll give you another example because Paul's here from Ford. I mean, when the U.S. was talking about raising emission standards, the industry said, all right, if you're going to raise it, can we coordinate between Canada and the U.S. so that you raise them in ways that match up so that we can produce one car for both jurisdictions? And that makes perfect sense. The industry was for a higher regulation standard, but coordination made a big difference in a cost sense.
But so there's so many regulatory agencies out there. In that example, in food safety, how in the heck did the governments get them to agree? I mean, it's tough enough for the United States to get its regulatory industry in line and do so. How are the president and the prime minister going to practically do this?
Well, it's not going to be easy, and I think that's one of the beauties of the Regulatory Cooperation Council that was stressed to me early on, is that, look, we're not going to try to resolve every itty-bitty difference between the U.S. and Canada. We can't. We'll be doing this forever. Careers will live and die if we try to do that. The better approach is to take a systemic approach to this, is how do we change the way we approach this? And that's why I mentioned the word equivalency earlier. So even, for example, I'm going to take a big risk here, talking about one issue. One of the things that my industry does is, well, we use a lot of domestic beef in the U.S. and Canada. We also have to import amount of really lean beef from countries that specialize in grass-fed cattle. And so, but some of that cattle or beef comes from countries that have had something called foot and mouth disease, which U.S. and Canadian farmers do not want to have in their cows. So they have to go through certain tests. Canada has one test, the U.S. has one test, and they're really different. But when we have to, on occasions where we have to bring in the imported beef, we have to go through both tests. Canada's test costs actually a lot more products. We lose money in the process, or we have to raise our prices. So one of the benefits is that if Canada can accept the U.S. test, or vice versa, that would be enormously beneficial. An example of we're having okay, you don't have to change your regulation, but you know what? If it's good enough for the U.S. and it's proven to work, it's good enough for Canada, and vice versa. So you pick one test or the other, and you're done. Now, the good news is, under the U.S. USDA regulatory system, they have inspectors at plants all over the world that import ingredients, meat, poultry, and pork ingredients to the United States. So where Canada does not. So in this case, this is a great example where Canada can take advantage of the U.S. regulatory system to clear things, where they agree, okay, your system works, we're going to go ahead and adapt or accept your product without having to change our regulation.
And we're not inventing the wheel on this
Right.
stuff. There already is a very well-developed global system. The WTO agreements, technical barriers to trade, and the sanitary, phytosanitary agreements, which are also in the NAFTA. These have some good guidelines for us about, your standards, regulations should be based on science, evidence-based reasons for why you have the standards and regulations that you do. You should use the least trade restrictive measures possible. And that you should resort to international guidelines, standard-setting organizations, et cetera, whenever possible, to gently encourage folks towards harmonization and cooperation and alignment. I mean, a lot of it is, I think, is just a lack of communication, a lack of coordination, that we have never had to have the regulators and the business community and the trade negotiators, et cetera, all in the same room at the same time, drilling down on common issues. And so having to look at these things is moving the agenda forward. I was told when we started this process that when the U.S. is planning a new standard, a new regulation, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the government of Canada from Canadian manufacturers, cross-border manufacturers, to just de facto adopt that U.S. regulation or policy, whatever it is, because that's going to cost those manufacturers money if there's going to be that difference. And so the fellow who was telling me this said, so what we tend to do is we'll wait 6 months, make sure the U.S. actually does what it says it's going to do, and then we'll adopt the same thing. Well, what Canada and the U.S. would both benefit from is the opportunity to sit down together in that advanced process and discuss how it would work for both and how they can benefit from efficiencies and economies of scale.
And one of the things that you note in the international debate about this is, back in the Clinton administration, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development was tasked to taking a look at regulatory reform across the OECD. And what they found with regard to the U.S. and Canada is that both of those countries, both our countries, have a fairly fair system. foreign interests are allowed to participate in the rulemaking process. Companies can come forward and say, we have a concern. They're not treated as alien because they're not domiciled or headquartered in North America. And the regulations may be confusing, but they're fair to everybody. We don't discriminate on the basis of national origin. So companies participate, et cetera. Now, we have regulatory capture problems. There are areas where industries have glommed onto rulemaking as a way of getting a leg up or home field advantage on other companies. And that's something we're both struggling with and trying to ferret out. Particularly as tariffs are less and less available to provide those advantages, there are companies that hide behind that, and they've got congressional backers, and they try to find ways to find a safe harbor in that space, which is a challenge. But I think what will work in our favor for regulatory cooperation, something that Laura was mentioning, which is that there's an efficiency challenge. We live in times of constrained budgets. And if you look at what happened at your law firms, what's happened in the private sector from the 90s to the 2000s, we've gone through a productivity revolution. It's the way we compete with the Chinas and Indias of the world. How do we do it? Well, we don't have as many secretaries anymore. We have to keep our own calendars. We got the BlackBerry, the email. We've gone to information technology to get more work out of fewer people, do more with less, which has been, the mantra. Not that we necessarily would have loved doing that. We had to do that to stay ahead, and we've done really well. Government is going to face, I think, in the next decade, a challenge of doing more with less. It's not that the mission will change. It's not that they'll be saying, oh, no, you don't have to regulate so much. But it'll be saying, you're going to have fewer people. You're going to have less money. The budgets are tight. We're not going to raise taxes as much as you'd like. And in that environment, they're going to be trying to find ways, can we lean on, say, an inspection done in Canada, which is perfectly good, that take some resources off of us? Can we have information technology systems so the data is moving back and forth so we can kind of look and verify and do forensic audit to make sure if we have a problem we can track it back? But do we need to have the belt and suspenders if we don't have money for either? I think not.
Now, if I could challenge you just a little bit on something that Laura had brought up in her paper, there seems to be an incentive for regulators to regulate for the sake of, not to be cynical, but job security. So as the government gets pressure to be leaner and meaner, are we going to face pushback from government to increase regulations to keep their jobs?
I'll start with that, and then these guys can join in. These are my two phones. This is my Canadian phone, which actually is made by BlackBerry, a Canadian company. And this is my American phone, which is a very cool Motorola Android. And the way you know that this is my American phone is there's AT&T on the back. So this works well in this country, and this works well when I go home. Although, to tell you the truth, I actually swap out the SIM cards because my American phone's better. These phones were both inspected, tested, certified for all sorts of reasons. The FCC and CRTC were very interested in how it works on the public band and whether or not it's got the right aerials, the antennas. The health inspectors were concerned that it's not going to melt down in my hand, that it doesn't have any toxic chemicals in it, that this glass doesn't shatter, that it's not a choking hazard. We're very concerned about choking hazards, let me tell you, on the regulatory front. So the regulators who inspected these phones, they weren't worried about business competitiveness. They weren't worried about efficiency. They were worried about doing their job, and their job says, make it safe, keep it safe. That's the hill that you are charged with defending. Well, now we're asking these guys to say, yeah, but can you do it more efficiently? Can you do it so that our businesses are more competitive and so that we have lower costs and more bang for the buck? I think it's going to be a bit of a war of attrition. We have to push those guys to understand that this is not going away. I mean, I think they kind of hunkered down and waited it out through the SPP process, and they were right. We did go away. But in this case, I think continued pressure, continued political attention is what we need in order to maybe not balance security and prosperity, but maybe it's safety and prosperity or safety and efficiency to get the regulators to be thinking of this broader domain of priorities.
David, I'm going to surprise you a little bit. As somebody in the private sector, I'm going to defend the regulators a little bit here. Not all of them. Just to be clear on that one. I have noticed a bit of a sea change, not at all agencies in the U.S., but at some, and I will also say in Canada, where the workload and demands on an increasingly stressed regulatory system has gotten so big and heavy in the face of, as Laura mentioned, tighter and tighter resources. They're now screaming for a little bit of help. And they know they're not going to get it from Congress anytime soon. They're not going to get it from the public that's got their own reasons to hang on to their own resources, except they actually have them. So they've actually begun to look for new and creative ways to cooperate with the regulated community on trying to help come up with smarter, more effective regulations. They can do their job a little easier and not do a lot of work that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think we're seeing that with the BTB to some extent. I'll give you one agency in the U.S. that I think has clearly bought into that, and it's the Food and Drug Administration. I mentioned earlier the Food and Drug Safety Modernization Act. The Deputy Commissioner for Food said, I'm going to create a process where I'm going to partner with the private sector to help me figure out how to do these new rules. They get to do 50 different rules, guidelines, regulations, and advisories to help implement this, not just for the U.S., but for all the world that wants to bring ingredients or products into the United States and by eventually Canada. So I think that I've seen a sea change there where they've got a very inclusive, very transparent process, but they're looking to the companies that have the expertise in-house. Tell us what you do. They know, for example, the Food and Drug Administration inspects a plant in the U.S. about once every 2 or 3 years on average. Yet one of my plants that may supply another food company, we do make ingredients for the food companies, we'll get 10, 11, 12 inspections a year from our customers. And those inspections are far more rigorous than what the FDA requires. So they're saying, oh, maybe we can learn something, maybe we can rely on these. That's why one of the major parts of the new law is how do we take advantage of third-party inspectors to do the work and help supplement the work of the FDA, and of course being supervised and held accountable. So that's an example of where I think we're starting to see a bit of a sea change with the regulators in terms of how they approach this process. They're starting to realize, oh, we're kind of all in this together. And I think it's a great, I'm hoping it will grow into other agencies, not to mention the EPA would be a good example.
I want to jump in and quote Shakespeare, which is always dangerous to a bunch of lawyers because he said mean things about lawyers. But, the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. We as a society are so risk paranoid. One, kid chokes on Pop Rocks or a cell phone, and all of a sudden, it's a national crisis. One little bit of Tylenol has been tampered with by a kook, a crazy guy out there, and we're all pulling things off the shelves and panicked. And CNN will do a week on shark attacks because somebody got nibbled. We talked about on the border side risk management. Well, I think we need to think about risk management ourselves in the regulatory system. Are we overregulated not because of business or government, but because we ourselves demand 100% safety from everything, from the flu to serial killers? I think we may have to deal with a little more risk tolerance in our society. Now, the second thing I would say, and this is regarding the change in government, the last time the size of the federal bureaucracy shrunk was the Clinton administration. And it shrunk because the greatest generation, Tom Brokaw loves them, finally said, okay, we're retiring. We're going to move out. And the administration took the advantage of that to say, okay, we're not going to replace one-to-one. We're going to have fewer people come in. And that helped the government actually shrink a bit. Didn't last long. But we now have the baby boomers dominating the bureaucracy, and they're wonderful folks. I don't know that they plan to live out their lives working in Washington. And I suspect that we're going to have an opportunity, if we've pensioned them off well, to let them retire with many happy, healthy years to go, with their kids living in the basement, to be able to shrink the size of government again. And to do that in a context of regulatory reform might help us to get where you quite rightly point out we may have to go.
Will the results of the 2012 election play an impact on whether or not that's possible?
I'll say this about the election. If you look at this agenda, it was there in a form under the SPP. And if you look at the SPP agenda, it was there in a form during the Clinton years. We have been talking about this stuff for a long time. And regulatory reform, as I mentioned, goes at least back to Ford and earlier. This is a bipartisan agenda. There are differences of emphasis, especially, say, on environment. Some people would like regulatory reform so it works more effectively, so that we are safer from environmental challenges. So you're going to get little changes along the way. But this notion of international cooperation and regulatory reform and a more efficient, effective government doing what it's there to do, I think that's bipartisan. So I think whatever happens to the election, we'll see some version of this continue. It may be rebranded, but that's really kind of harmless.
Yeah, David, I want to totally agree with what Chris said and add a bit to it. I mean, this is one of those issues that really does transcend partisan politics. I don't see, in fact, when the Beyond the Border Action Plan was announced in December, the two members of Congress that came out first and foremost to embrace it, one was a Michigan Republican, Candace Miller, who serves on the Homeland Security Committee, and the Democrat, Bill Owens from New York. So this is a great unifier. So you might have a little bit of slow things down. If there were a change in administrations come after November, you might see a little bit of a slowdown as new personnel comes in place. But tell you what, the first time that the Prime Minister meets with the new president, this is going to be back on track. Because, and to his credit, he has really been a huge driver in this process.
Now, the SPP, that was the previous attempt directly before the Regulatory Cooperation Council, governments love acronyms, that one was dropped when Obama came into office, and then this plan was adopted. What was the reason for that, and I guess why are we so certain, other than the issues will continue on, that this Regulatory Cooperation Council won't go away?
Well, I think the first thing to underscore is that it wasn't that President Obama was elected, inaugurated, and said, I'm going to kill the SPP. In fact, he honored the commitment made by his predecessor at New Orleans. George W. Bush committed that there would be another North American Leaders Summit. It was Mexico's turn to host. He went to Guadalajara, and he talked to the leaders, and he said, what's working? What's not working? And I think there was a feeling on the part of all three governments, even in New Orleans when it was still George W. Bush, that the process had gotten in the way. There were people out there who thought, oh, this SPP is an insidious plot to build the NAFTA superhighway through my house, no matter where I live in America. This is a destruction of American sovereignty. And yeah, a lot of those charges went out. Nobody defended against them because they thought they were so silly, but they became the thing. Whether it was Lou Dobbs complaining about these things or Jerome Corsi, there was somebody complaining about this agenda. And 20 working groups. The SPP had 10 on the prosperity side and 10 on the security side. Seemed like almost a star chamber of people doing something, and you didn't really know what they were up to, so you could assume they were up to anything. And there's this horrible thing about our information age. I want to complain about society again, in that people have the idea that if you don't know something, you accuse people of it, and if they don't deny it, it must be true. And so some blogger out there would say, oh, I've heard the SPP is going to take away, our toothpaste or something. And all of a sudden it gets repeated, and next thing you know, nobody knows where it came from, but it sounds like it might be true. And so I think that the president quite rightly said this process needs to be streamlined. And the Guadalajara process came up with a 10-item agenda, was more limited, but it was also very practical. And then having looked at that experience, we didn't have the next summit in Canada, for which we should have had, just a tough scheduling issue. We then are picking up with the North American Leaders Summit in 2 weeks, because we were going to have it in Honolulu as on the sidebar of the APEC, and that didn't happen because the Mexican president wasn't able to do it. We fell back on dual bilateralism. We have a Canada-U.S. process, we have a U.S.-Mexico process, we have North American Leaders Summits. So I think it just took a while to re-gel as they tried to tweak it to make it more effective and results-oriented. I'm very pleased that it didn't get caught in a partisan vice.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, I think that's one. He's right. I think there were three basic reasons that when you step back and look at it, they say, okay, this was in concept, this is good. There was a lot of energy behind it. There's clearly support for it. What happened? It didn't work. And I think that it wasn't just that President Obama came in at the end of the SPP. We have to remember too that there was a change in government in Canada as well as Mexico during while the SPP was underway. And one of the conversations that I had with some senior Canadian officials was that, well, gee, when he came in after it was started, well, this really lacks a lot of focus. And there isn't really a timeline here. There's not any real accountability for it. There isn't any buy-in by the agencies. And so let's sit back and do this differently. And I think they came up with a structure that really learned from the SPP. It's absolutely correct in what the first panel said. This is an evolutionary process. They're not starting over from scratch. They're learning from what worked and did not work previously. So while we're still making occasional mistakes here and there, and we can talk about those if you want, I do think the fact that, one, we have now a much stronger what I call, pardon my Canadian friends, executive branch leadership. We have the Prime Minister's office, much stronger, I think, engagement here. We have very strong White House-driven leadership going on in the U.S. on this issue. And the big change is that the agencies have bought into this. They now get it. Now, part of it's because, as I mentioned earlier, the regulatory environment has changed and realizing, oh, we really can't do this ourselves. But also, I think the realization, too, that trying to do a trilateral effort was just way too cumbersome.
I think for Canada, the challenge is and continues to be related to the political question is U.S. political attention. Regulatory alignment for Canada with the United States isn't a choice. It isn't something we decide to do. It's something that we must continue to do all the time, or our economy sinks. With the majority of our exports still going to the United States, we must maintain regulatory alignment, whether it's through a formal process or something that we just have to do unilaterally and ad hoc. I think Canadian officials were maybe a bit taken by surprise when the U.S. came to them and said, hey, let's discuss regulatory cooperation. I was actually at those initial meetings and like, oh, okay, let's do that. And during those initial meetings, the U.S. officials were like, honestly, so do y'all use the same plugs as we do down there, up here? So, yeah, we use the same plugs. Really? 98% of Canada's standards and regulations are already aligned. But what Canada is concerned about is how long does this window of attention stay on us? I mean, U.S. attention is like a lighthouse, you know? It's on you and you get the whole weight of the universe and then it goes away. So Canadians are going, how long do we get this light and what do we do with it? Because trade with Canada is not sexy. It is not sexy on the U.S. government's trade agenda. Asia is sexy. Brazil. Emerging markets, the TEC, the Transatlantic Cooperation Agreement with the European Union. That's interesting and sexy. Canada's just the bird in the hand. It's the same old, same old. So you've got that, and then you've got the trilateral thing. 'Cause there is a U.S.-Mexico regulatory cooperation initiative as well. The Mexicans started first. Canada has gone faster, but the Mexicans actually started first. Do those two initiatives ever come back together? Do we make this trilaterally eventually? Or is it, you know, dance with whoever you can? And so Canada, I think, is concerned about what to do with the political window of opportunity and how long it's going to last.
And let me just add one thing. This is sort of a story some of you Canadians will remember. A few years ago, Congress came up with a great idea that they would adjust when we turn our clocks backward and forward for daylight savings time. You may remember that. Well, so they decided to do this, and one day the Canadians woke up and said, oh, we've got to change our clocks. Now, they didn't really get any vote in this. Nobody asked the Canadians, well, Canada can't afford to change their clocks 2 weeks later. It just confused everybody. So Canada found itself having to make a big change that affected a lot of people's lives with no vote. And I think one of the things about this process that we as Americans have to be able to deliver on is I think Canada is open to working with us, but they want a voice. They want to be able to have a say in some of this, or at least some warning. And in that regard, we have an obligation to try to take this process seriously by giving Canada at least that much.
Marty, I see you have a question. Can you just, before you ask, state your affiliation? Okay.
Marty Gelfand, Congressman Kucinich's office here in Cleveland. Recently, I was at a christening of a Coast Guard vessel at a shipyard here in Cleveland, and the owner of the shipyard got up and started to make a speech, and he was talking about how he had to, in the work that he does, he has to comply with regulations from about 100 different agencies, federal Canada, federal US, all the different states and provinces, and environmental, security, commerce, health and safety, labor, all these things. And I thought he was going to be grousing about it, and instead, he kind of turned the whole thing around and said that, you know, he likes it. He's been around a long time. He remembers when Lake Erie was a lot dirtier than it is today. You know, the people who he and people who work there, you know, like to get out in the water and recreate. He likes that his employees have the best health care money can buy, and that their families are healthy and they're happy. And, you know, just like buying steel and other raw materials to make boats and paying taxes and doing, you know, all the expenses of running a business, you know, he just puts it on the balance sheet and, you know, follows the regs and does his job. And he doesn't see why people are complaining about it. And I just wanted to know if, you know, you probably get a lot of input from people who are complaining about all these disharmonious regs, as it were, but I mean, really, is it a problem?
Well, I would say one thing. A lot of times when you talk about regulation, the assumption is we're having a discussion about deregulation, race to the bottom, as people will say. And it's not necessarily that. It's about getting the good result, but in a way that allows people to also trade, so that you're not adding to a burden that makes a product unsaleable on the other side of the border if it doesn't add to the safety for people. So I think that there's some of the confusion comes because people think, well, RCC is going to deregulate something. I don't think it will. I think we're going to stay safely regulated, but I think we're going to end up being regulated a bit more efficiently for a variety of reasons.
Let me bring it home in a way. I think my answer to your question is yes, it is a problem. It's not because that we're afraid of, don't want, don't like, don't cooperate with our regulators and agencies. We recognize the need, for example, a very strong food safety system in which the public has very strong confidence in the products they eat. Very, very important. That's why we supported the Food Safety Modernization Act, which does have more regulation, although in a very different way. But let's go to reality for a second. What are we talking about here? Let's talk about the actual person walking into that Safeway, Acme, Super Value store who wants to buy a product. Studies show that about a quarter of the consumers walking into the grocery store right now are having a real hard time paying their grocery bills. These regulatory standards, the requirements that are duplicative, that don't mean a lot, that don't contribute to the safety of a product, add to the cost of those products. We shouldn't be doing things that makes it harder for consumers to be able to buy products and feed their families. That's the bottom line in my book.
Sorry, yeah,
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's not just about us. It's about our competitiveness in the world. We have much higher labor costs than the rest of the world. Other countries that never used to manufacture are now manufacturing, and they're eating our lunch. So where we can save costs and still have good results, still be safe, we need to eliminate those costs and become more efficient.
I want to come back to a point that Chris Sands touched on, and that is the whole area of private sector rulemaking. This is a big, important area. You know, the Joint Action Plan is all about government regulation, but private sector rulemaking, standard setting, is a very important part of international trade, more than most people appreciate. I'll give you an example. If you're selling pipe made in the U.S. into the oil patch in Canada, in Alberta, those pipes have to be made to ASTM, American Society of Testing and Materials Specifications. You can't sell a product unless it has ASTM certification. Got nothing to do with government regulation. These are standards that are set by the private sector. And that, applies in a whole range of areas. Letters of credit in international banking. It's all regulated by the International Chamber of Commerce rules for letters of credit. Got nothing to do with treaties or governments. Private sector rulemaking. And what I found in the Joint Action Plan is it doesn't even address this issue. This area of private sector rulemaking is vital in international trade. It allows products to get into markets. It allows services to be exchanged across borders. A good example is LEED certification.
Yep.
Environmental buildings. Environmental buildings that meet environmental standards. That's got nothing to do with government regulation. It is a standard-setting body, private sector, that has developed those rules. And I want to ask the panelists how they think this kind of issue, this whole phenomenon of private rulemaking, can be folded into the Joint Regulatory Action Plan, which doesn't even address these things.
Laura?
I think there's a great opportunity for private sector rulemaking, especially in technical and specific areas that governments don't have competence to rule on. In these areas, pipes and elevators and banking and whatever, we need that expertise to be weighing in on what we're doing. At the same time, we need to have a broader framework in which we determine how we bring these folks on board. What authority do they have? Are they making rules? Are they contributing to rules? How does that affect national, state, municipal sovereignty over rulemaking? So having those folks involved, I think, is essential, and we're going to see more and more of it. But how we bring them on board is key, and I think we need smart folks like you to figure out frameworks in which these new forms of rulemaking can be aligned.
Yeah, I think I prefer to call it self-regulation, not private sector regulation. I think there's probably not much difference in that phrase, but there's a tremendous amount of self-regulation that goes on. I mean, in a variety of forms. I will say, though, that oftentimes it's the government that will come to us and say, can you guys fix this problem? Whether it be different standards, and sometimes agencies take a role. I mentioned earlier about the fact that we have this new food safety law in the U.S. They're now looking to us to see what we can do on our own. In the area of advertising, which is protected very strenuously by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Even there, we have some very rigorous self-regulatory standards, and we turn to other private nonprofit groups to help us set standards on what we can advertise to the public. So yeah, it's something that is extremely important, and I totally agree with you. And I do think I would have to go back and reread the action plan and maybe some of the other documents, but I think it's kind of inherent in there to some degree. I think it's part of being smarter and having more cooperation is how do we make it easier for these companies to sell goods and services in an effective way, and self-regulation clearly is a part of that. It's a reality.
I just want to add one thing. I agree with you. But it's not just industry self-regulation. And you think about, for example, dolphin safe tuna. It's not the tuna industry, it's independent standard
That's right,
setting
third party,
organizations
right.
that give that endorsement. So there's more than just self-regulation by
Absolutely.
industry.
There is accountability. I mean, for example, the new food safety law does have a process for accrediting third-party laboratories who do some of the testing, which right now it's either FDA or nobody. And number two is third-party inspectors, which is an issue for me that I've been working on for a number of years, is how do we professionalize the whole industry of third-party food inspectors? They're out there and they do a very good job, but there really were no standards, there was no accountability. Now there's going to be. So you're exactly right. I agree with you.
The only thing I would add is that part of what will make that appealing is that we have a lot of venue shopping going on, and we talked about this earlier. There are the U.S.-Mexico talks, there's Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, there's what's going on with the transatlantic. Many regulators, you know, the reason we have this RCC agenda, these are the things that have been the most irritating and that are most governmental. So we really do need the governments to talk about. But I think from a business perspective, a lot of people will say, let's do this in the private sector and go global because we can get a result faster, and we want something that makes our product as portable as possible.
Can I give you another example? And this is an area where the government does not regulate at all right now, and that's in the area of environmental sustainability. We don't hear much from the agencies about companies trying to reduce water use and whatnot. You know who's really driven that process globally? A little company called Walmart has done that more than anybody else in the globe in terms of coming to us and saying, you want to sell your products in my store? I want to see your carbon footprint. I want to know what you're doing to make sure your product is sustainable. So in the whole area of environmental sustainability, where we've all kind of figured out, oh, if we want to make money, we can all want to save money. We've got to manage our resources far more effectively. There's a whole global infrastructure in place right now to deal with that issue, and it does not involve, with a few exceptions, governments anywhere in the globe.
Just a quick story, sorry. I took a complaint one day from a small business operator who was going across the border and wondered why he always had to throw out his boots or buy new boots at Walmart when he crossed the border. Because in the United States, his boots, I believe, had a green circle, and in Canada, they had a green triangle. And it was required that he had the green triangle boots when he was working in Canada. It turns out that it was the same private sector organization that was monitoring the standards for both green circle and green triangle, but the two hadn't been brought into alignment so that they would be recognized on either side of the border. That would be a simple fix, and I hope that fix is underway, because it was the same group at the top of the umbrella.
And not a plan to get people to buy more boots, right?
Maybe it was a Walmart thing. The Walmarts in Buffalo are full of trash cans with boots.
We got another question. What's your name and where are you coming from?
Aaron O'Brien from Baker and Hostetler. Conceptually, I understand the value and the efficiency of the regulatory reform in eliminating duplicative inspection. In my experience, it seems that there is some degree of risk in relying on someone else's appropriate and proper application of a standard. In the practice of law, oftentimes we do our own due diligence. We don't just rely on someone else's diligence. So my question is really, how do we find the comfort in the deference to someone else's inspection and their inspection process?
What? Going back to the previous panel, there was this discussion of the information environment. And I think one of the things that we can work on is data sharing and transparency for these regulatory processes, so that it's possible for you to say, okay, well, we know the Canadians have been inspecting this. Let's look at some of the, some of the data going on in sectors. If you're worried about a problem, you can go back forensically and try to find out where did the problem occur, what was the problem with Canada's inspection, if that was the issue. The more we're mutually aware of what we're doing, we're creating data records that score the same stuff that we can go back if we have a problem, the better we're going to be able to police this and trust. I mean, sort of the old trust but verify problem. And I'll give you an example of where that has actually worked out of the SPP, and that was improved phytosanitary standards and an improved process for determining when you had a problem. You may remember, I know you'll remember, the bovine spongiform encephalitis, mad cow outbreak of 1.5 cows in Alberta that shut effectively the border. And actually Canada had been involved in a similar case where they accused Brazil of having BSE, and that meant that not only Canada having made the accusation, but the United States and Mexico also shut their border because we had this common market. So phytosanitary regulations were designed to absolutely protect the consumer. They brought down the hammer, but then the way that they operated, it was very hard to lift that ban. Because you had a lot of very hardworking scientists in the different government agencies who'd say, well, are you absolutely 100% certain that there's not anywhere in the herd, no more of this? And none of them could ever say with 100% certainty that was true. So it waited for a politician to say, okay, I'll take the heat, you can lift the ban. In the SPP, the governments of Canada, the US, and Mexico took a look at this and they said, well, what if we use what the private sector does in terms of lot numbers and tracking, product to be basically, if we have an incident, go back and figure out how much product we have to destroy. What's the minimum to protect public safety? And then we had this outbreak of, was it salmonella in tomatoes and peppers from Mexico?
Yeah.
Peppers. And, it was a big thing. It was in the news. The governments worked really well to zero in on where that origin was, to destroy what they had to destroy, and meanwhile, perfectly safe products that had no taint, no possibility of taint, just went back and forth across the border like normal. So we could trust each other, but we could verify each other's results, and we had better data to try to do enforcement. And I think all of that reflects where we would try to go.
Yeah, Jim.
Jim Peterson from Toronto. This is a great panel, and I'm very excited about it personally because I've just come off a stint as the lead negotiator for Ontario with Quebec to reduce barriers to trade, investment, mobility, and to create a common economic space. And going back to what Ambassador Jacobson was talking about his Cheerios, we had two really tight bones of contention. Number one, for years we'd been trying to fight in the courts Quebec's rule that your margarine couldn't have yellow coloring in it. Yeah. And we finally won that at the table. The second one was Quebec creamers for your coffee have to be 15 milliliters. In Ontario, they had to be 10 milliliters. We were not able to solve that one. But the one thing we did find was that Quebec was way ahead of Ontario in two areas of administration. One was in public procurement, where they had one website you went to find out what was up for bid. Ontario had over 100.
Wow.
So we thought, Ontario, let's make it more efficient. Well, the pushback there was incredible, and I'll come to the conclusion on that later. The other area was in pre-publishing regulations that were going to have an impact on productivity. And Quebec had a way of doing it. 45 days notice. Again, incredible pushback from Ontario to give notice to stakeholders. Finally, we won both of those arguments because the two premiers were totally committed to this process. And in spite of bureaucratic kickback, they both got done. So it's a great opportunity. to elevate standards and bring the whole thing up.
I would just like to comment on Minister Peterson's statements. I think that we cooperate. Canada and U.S. regulators cooperate every day of the week on an ad hoc basis. They just pick up the phone and they talk about everything. Common language, common problems, common client base. What is needed, though, as Mr. Peterson just mentioned, is that political leadership from the top, is the resources and the will to make lasting frameworks for cooperation. And what do we need to do that? We need a common framework for consultation. Here's how we consult. Here's where we publish. Here's how we notify. Here's all the ways that we can work together to build confidence and verification. The trouble with Canada-U.S. trade sometimes is it's too easy, and so we rely on the ad hoc processes. And what we need are some formalized processes for cooperation that will bring us forward.
Now, Chris, I know you'd written, to piggyback off of what Laura said, about some of the stumbling blocks the countries are going to face going forward if we want this to be a success. In your mind, what do you think, in addition to the framework, what are some of the things that...
I think that one of the challenges of SPP was that it was, there were limited stakeholder inputs. We had the North American Competitiveness Council that got the business community together, but we were missing a lot of the civil society groups. That's been improved here. There's much more plug-in for stakeholder groups, but that also increases the likelihood that people who don't like outcomes or are worried about things will go to Congress. And I know that good faith effort by negotiators has, in this process, has been to brief Congress. And I don't put Parliament in the same basket. Parliament has parliamentary discipline and is okay. But Congress, as Governor Blanchard, former congressman, will tell you, has no discipline, or has some, but so that, yeah, no, the troublemaking possibility of Congress is a big one, and I'd like to see them involved in this process. I also think we need to bring some of the judicial in, and I know this is going to get me in big trouble, but let me just say, we saw a Supreme Court ruling this week that in the case of an EPA ruling, an individual who'd found that, you know, this was a land issue, it hit, some folks in Idaho had their land declared a wetland or whatever, that an individual has a right to a day in court against a regulator who brings a regulation down on them, and before they have to pay daily fines and so on and so forth. It'll be interesting, but I think that to make this stuff really durable, I'd love to see the day that the Canadian business comes forward and says, yeah, you know, American regulators owed me a chance to comment, owed me a fair hearing, and they didn't. And the court says, you know, that's right. In terms of administrative procedure, and we're always talking about changing the Administrative Procedure Act, there's a lot that we could do to continue this tradition of fairness and inclusiveness. And I know we're talking about the Administrative Procedure Act changes in the House now, and they've talked about adding to the clearance period of 90 days to the Federal Register even longer. They've talked about having every regulation over $100 million in commercial impact have to go through a White House process. So there are different things that we could do, but I think a more inclusive process is going to be necessary to get us to where we want to go after the low-hanging fruit.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're running very tight on time. So if I could ask the both of you to ask your questions in conjunction, briefly introduce yourself, your question, and then we'll...
Or could you harmonize them? No, sorry, just kidding, just kidding.
That may be more difficult. I don't know the other question. My question has to do with regulations going forward, and in particular in the food industry. One of the concerns we have in healthcare costs are the costs of treating chronic disease. A mushrooming thing. If we could address chronic disease, we'd take a big bite out of all the pills people buy every week just to deal with hypertension, diabetes, and things of this nature. In Canada, I've been pushing strongly to have much tougher regulations on sodium and sugar content in processed foods. And I was encouraged to do this by my doctor, who told me never to eat canned soup, for example. My question is...
I don't like your doctor very much.
I know things are being done, but is the implication of what we're talking about today that in regulatory coordination, that if Canada wants to have much higher, much tougher standards on food and on salt, or sugar content in processed foods, that we should really wait till the U.S. comes around to that point of view or not. I mean, we had that problem with sugar and the World Health Organization standards. The United States resisted for the longest time higher standards, and the sugar industry lobbied very hard, and we eventually got some standards, but it took a long fight. I mean, that's the one thing that concerns me, is that if we want to do something that is useful for the health of people, do we have to wait until the United States, for example, decides it wants to do the same thing?
Of course not. In fact, at various times the U.S. leads on one issue and Canada leads on the other, and as you said, the World Health Organization leads on all these issues to some degree and has enormous influence around the world, probably less so with the industrialized world. The example of sodium, I'll just be very frank with you, was something that the industry began leading on 30 years ago. The amount of sodium in my soup products has declined over 50% on average over the last 25 years, because we started back then. We didn't need FDA or USDA or Health Canada to tell us to reduce sodium. We figured it out a long time ago. And now we have been advising the government, and we have a great relationship both with Health Canada and the FDA and other agencies around the world, and how do we get sodium levels down, knowing that it can help contribute for some people, chronic disease, not everybody has a sodium problem, in addressing it. So I think it's worked pretty effectively. But no, I don't think there's anything. In fact, I think in the area of sodium reduction and other areas of nutrition, there's a pretty good level of collaboration. Could it be stronger? Absolutely. Are they aligned yet? No. In fact, it's the FDA and what the U.S. institutions are doing on sodium reduction are actually a little tougher than what Health Canada is doing right now. So we'll see where it all winds up. But this is an area where there's a lot of disagreement. There isn't a lot of scientific agreement on the issue of sodium reduction, its impact on human health. I won't go into it now, but I do think that either country can lead. There's no reason why one can't lead the other and bring one to the table.
Yeah, as a trade policy person, I mean, there's no reason why Canada and the U.S. can't have different standards for whatever reason, and they can both be implemented, and Canada's not bound by the U.S. decision. But on the other hand, do we need regulation in this area, or is this a consumer choice issue? If there's an opportunity to buy low-sodium soup somewhere in the market, do you need Big Brother telling you you must only have the low-sodium soup? I mean, that takes us into Mr. Peterson's point about having to have the yellow dye in the Quebec margarine so you know it's margarine. In Canada, we had to have brown coloring, or you could only caffeinate brown soda pop so that mothers would know the difference between the caffeinated pop and the non-caffeinated pop. I don't know that we need that level of regulation, but if we as a society decide we should, we have to accept it's also going to raise our costs.
Okay, we've got...
Really of human health, there's a serious issue there. It's not just Big Brother.
We've got one very brief second for a question, and then everybody's going to go to lunch. So
okay, I'll be very, very quick, because I just wanted to end up with this, and it sort of works with David's question. That Canada right now obviously is negotiating another agreement, and that's with the European Union, the CETA. And I guess one would expect and can expect that it will have a chapter on regulatory cooperation. And so I guess I just wanted to underscore that, you know, what's going to end up here, it seems to me, an awful lot of pressure for Canada to converge in the setting of those standards to the European standards, which are a lot more bureaucratic under that process, it seems to me, just the nature of how the EU works. And I'm just wondering, Kelly, from your perspective, as someone who will have to operate in that space, you're going to be, it seems to be pulled in two different directions, and whether you have any thoughts about how those two regulatory regimes will work together.
It is an issue that hasn't been, it's a great question. It's one I've thought about, and I'm one of the few people I've thought about this inside the U.S. economy for a while. We're eager to see what the Canadians finally negotiate with Europe. There are several areas of European regulation of great concern to us. One is something called geographic indicators, where, for example, and I don't make Parmesan cheese in the U.S., but if you buy a package of Kraft or other product of Parmesan cheese, if Canada were to accept the Europeans' negotiating position, I'm not saying they will or have, but if they were, then Kraft would have to change that to something else, because Parmesan cheese can only apply to cheese grown in the Parma section of Italy. So that's an example where we have enormous implications on what's going to happen. That's why this beyond the border process is so important, because frankly, it won't matter a whole lot in my world what Canada negotiates with Europe if what we make here in North America isn't economically competitive with Europe. So that's why we need to kind of work on this, and that's why I think while many of the regulations we're doing in the U.S. right now have an impact and can help inform and can be benefited by the BTB, the beyond the border process. Same is true with Canada and Europe. I hope that they're considering what they're doing with the negotiations as it relates to the U.S. market as well. The implications are huge. And now you're hearing the U.S. talk about negotiating its own free trade agreement with Europe now. That's, of course, going to take several careers if that ever happens, but that's also now being talked about as we move to more of a global marketplace. It's a great question, something we're very focused on.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. This discussion will surely continue on. I want to give our panelists a big round of applause for their hard work today.